Hi, everyone, and welcome to a special year end episode. I'm your host, Bill Coffin, and this is the best of the Ethicast. "2024 has been a pretty eventful year in the ethics and compliance space, both for good and bad reasons. For every best practice that rightfully earned its deserved spotlight, there was a mammoth failure of controls or business integrity that also vied for our attention. Along the way, however, Ethisphere Chief Strategy Officer Erica Salmon Byrne joined the show to share her insights on some of the biggest E&C news stories as they broke, lending her valuable perspective and expertise not just to understand these stories in the moment, but to put them in their proper context for driving the ethics and compliance discipline forward. In this episode, we present to you some of those moments and insights from the biggest E&C news breaks of the year. And we'll have links for you in the show notes for where you can learn more about each of these news stories you're about to see. And now, here's Erica. In its official statement around these corruption charges, Trafigura notes that they have committed to building a robust compliance and governance program since the time alleged in the charges, since 2009 to 2011. But when you go to their website, the details of their governance and compliance program are kind of hard to find. They're buried in their sustainability section. And even then, it's not exactly an intuitive or super detailed accounting of the program. So I guess my question to you is, when a company wants to share with the public how its program works, when it wants to build that confidence that it's being forthright about its efforts here, what are some of the best practices you have seen with regards to website information, publicly available documents, et cetera?
I mean, look, Bill, we live in the information age, right? Finding information, if you want it to be found, is not hard. If the information is challenging to be found, it is because it's not a priority for the company to make sure that it can be found, right? This is not challenging. There's lots of great examples out there of companies that have made a deliberate decision to make it very clear how they have structured their program and what their priorities are. You can, as you said, you look on websites, it's one or maybe two clicks away from the main page. You read the ESG report, it's in the report. Some companies are even creating specific standalone ethics-related reports that talk about the program and the structure of the program. So a company that's truly committed to building a culture of transparency and accountability will be transparent and accountable with the way that they talk about that program in the public. And when that does not happen, it means one of two things. Either the company doesn't think the outside public has any reason to know. Trafigura is a private company, so they may, have made a decision that nobody on the outside needs to know. Now, given the position they're in, the ongoing investigations into their behavior, right? Because they're not done. All of the news stories note that there are, there's additional investigations out there. Yeah. Given the fact that they are under the scrutiny that they are under, and given the fact that they have the amount of activity, prosecutorial activity swirling around them, were I in their shoes and I had actually built a program that was worth bragging about, you would see it everywhere, right? It would be on the website. It would be on the main page. It would be something that I would talk about. My compliance chief would be out discussing what the company had built. We haven't seen any of that, right? We haven't seen any of that. And so my suspicion is that the words are being said because the lawyers have told the CEO that the words need to be said, and that there really is not very much underpinning those words.
The board of Fat Brands made headlines last year when it prompted numerous lawsuits over the removal of, I believe it was 5 independent board members.
5 independent directors, yeah.
Who were then replaced with members of Weiderhorn's family. So first, and the obvious question is, how much of a red flag is that to you as a governance expert? And secondly, from risk management perspective, how much does a move like that invite the kind of scrutiny that is bound to uncover any other misconduct if it exists?
Yeah. So, Bill, what happened in this particular situation, when Fat Brands went public, it went public as a controlled corporation. But the family had not elected to actually sit the board that way, right? They followed what all of us would see as more typical governance activities. So if I'm an investor in Fat Brands, yes, I understand that there's a controlling shareholder, but it's not being managed as a controlled corporation at that point. Yeah. What they did when they flipped the board is they took the 5 independent directors that were on the board at the time. They removed them. They replaced them with three of his family, three of his children, and two franchisees. And that is, if I'm an investor in Fat Brands, an enormous red flag, right? Because that basically means that there is no one in that boardroom that is going to be comfortable telling the leadership team no, and that they are truly a rubber stamp board at that point, right? Whatever it is the CEO wants, they're just going to go ahead and do. And even after he was no longer the CEO, whatever he wants as the controlling shareholder, he's going to go ahead and do. Now, part of his counterpoint, and you see this in some of the news articles, from that particular period in time, was, well, we always, disclosed the fact that it was a control corporation. And that is true, but just because it's a control corporation doesn't mean you don't have a fiduciary duty to the people who invested in the business, right? Yeah. The process, and you and I have talked about this, Bill, over the years, the process of going public is a compact, a social contract that you make with the people who have given you their money. And they give you money to grow the business. And in return, you're supposed to take good care of it. And when you don't do that, that is a violation of the way in which you are supposed to be accessing the capital markets. And, you end up in situations like this. So from my perspective, just looking at, the publicly available facts in this situation, every one of those directors should be ashamed of themselves.
Yeah. And, what was interesting is that as we were doing research for this episode, a statement that really struck me was, I think it was when the lawsuits regarding this board switch, were filed, and there's a bit of furor over it. The response from Fat Brands was, hey, we've always been a family-oriented business, so that's why we're putting family on the board. And that just struck me as a particularly disingenuous explanation, and one that didn't speak at all to how is this new slate of directors going to help, direct the company in a more meaningful way. It struck me as the reddest of flags.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at those, if you look at the description of who sits on the Fat Brands board, right? There is almost no one on that list that knows what good governance looks like. I won't say no one, because there's a couple of people with a background where they should have known better. But the fact of the matter is you've got people sitting on that board who have no idea how to handle the responsibility of being a director, because it is a responsibility. And they have no sense of how to engage in the kind of oversight that the business needed. And that's obvious by what has happened, right? It's not just the former CEO that's been indicted. The company's in a heck of a lot of trouble too, as is the rest of the, other members of the leadership team.
Yeah. And one last word about the board is that, I don't know any of those people personally, of course, but looking at their relationships to Weiderhorn himself, none of those people strike you as having any kind of authority to really challenge anything that Weiderhorn says. So if he says jump, they're going to say how high. And that's not the way it should be between CEO and the board.
That's the reason why, Bill, I referred to them as a rubber stamp board, right? There is not a single person that based on, the information that the company itself put on their website about who they are, that would have been in a position to look at Weiderhorn and say, you can't do
that. Every plea deal or resolution with the government holds lessons for compliance professionals. So can you tell me what are some of the biggest lessons that are to be learned here?
Bill, that's something that that you and I have talked about a lot in the past. No consent decree, no deferred prosecution agreement, no plea deal should really go unmined by compliance professionals. There are lessons in there for what could happen at your organization. With a little creativity, everybody can think of what this could look like for them. And then there are also lessons in how the regulators are thinking about issues right now and what they are expecting to see in the event that they come in to look at a program. And so, any compliance officer worth their salt should really be looking at all of those documents to make sure that they understand what the regulators might be expecting if they wind up in a conversation with them. There were a couple of things that stood out to me in the plea deal. The biggest one is the de-siloing of the program. So in the statement of facts, one of the things that the department says, and Boeing of course has to agree with as part of the plea deal, is the anti-corruption and anti-bribery program at Boeing was siloed. It was separate from any other compliance efforts that might have been in place at the organization. So it was sort of a one-off risk-specific program. And as part of the resolution of their issues, what Boeing has to do is Boeing has to connect that program with its safety and quality program, because the government is looking at safety and quality compliance failures as fraud failures. And so they have basically said, given the business that Boeing is in, that a failure of compliance and safety and quality is fraud on the government. And Boeing has to create a comprehensive program that links its anti-corruption and anti-bribery efforts to its quality efforts, and really holistically goes from across all of the risk areas, rather, that the organization is facing. We have been talking about de-siloing programs for a decade. We have been talking about data layering for a decade. And the reasons for that are exceptionally strong. Because if you think about compliance as a second line of defense model, where audit is your third line of defense, all of your compliance functions have to be pulling in the same direction. They have to be coordinated, and they have to be working together. We saw the first indications of this position from the government's perspective in the evaluation of corporate compliance programs updates, where they specifically said that in the event a program is in front of them, they will be asking, what data did you try to get your hands on that you couldn't? That might have prevented the issue that happened. That was the first indication of data layering, which is really this practice of saying, okay, here's my data set. What does your data set look like? Let's not be myopic about what we're looking for in the data, but let's instead partner together across quality, safety, IT, HR, finance, and compliance to and communications, all of those sister functions, to have a holistic view of what's happening across the business. We did a Bella Asks earlier this year where we talked about the Jurassic Park example, where if you are tracking your 47 velociraptors, you only ever see 47 velociraptors in the park. When the fact of the matter is you have, 4 times that many velociraptors, and you've got a velociraptor problem. Well,
Exactly.
basically what the government has said to Boeing in this plea deal is, you have a velociraptor problem, and you need to make sure that your program is set to be able to capture however many velociraptors there are in the park, not just the 47 that you've trained your program to look for.
Yeah, and the really exciting thing about all this, apart from the fact that we got a chance to say Velociraptor on the show one more time, but seriously though, one of the exciting things about this is that the path forward for Boeing is it's not all on the compliance function. It's
Right.
actually the path forward. It gives a lot of opportunity for all those sister functions to have a really important part to play in crafting the recipe for success for Boeing going forward, and so it gives a lot of people a chance to be the hero here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm reminded of the conversation that I had with Doug Lankler back when he was the chief compliance officer for Pfizer in the mid-aughts, when they went through their off-label marketing issues. And part of Doug's big campaign for Pfizer's program post the resolution of all of those challenges, it was a program that he called It's Mine. And the point of the It's Mine program was, whose responsibility is it to do the right thing? It's mine. Everybody was part of It's Mine. And it's
Yeah.
that same sort of attitude that Boeing is being asked to cultivate here, which is, you need to think about safety and quality as important as fraud, as corruption, as
Yeah.
bribery, as some of these other sort of significant risks. And if you don't think about it holistically, oh, guess what? Here comes your monitor to make sure that you are.
I'm so glad you brought up Pfizer, because that's such a great example of an organization that had a lot of work to do, turned it around, and embraced the solution. And as a result, in a way, Pfizer is also a very strategic organization. Boeing is very
Mhm.
strategic. We're all invested in Boeing being successful, right?
Absolutely.
And we're all invested in Pfizer being successful. And guess what? A pandemic came along. And because Pfizer put in that work, they were ready to seize the moment in a way that probably they couldn't have been if they had been the same organization they had been back in the mid-aughts. So
Right.
it's really exciting to see that, and I love the Pfizer example quite a lot. Rank and file TD Bank employees themselves took substantial bribes to help launder money. At one
Mhm.
point, the DOJ mentioned, I think, $57,000 in gift cards were given to kind of grease the wheels, and that strikes me as a high frequency, low severity aspect of bribery. Um, so I guess my question is, how does an organization of this size reset culturally to
Yeah.
prevent this kind of misconduct from occurring?
They've got to take a real hard look at their really everything from a compliance
Yeah.
perspective inside of TD Bank, and in particular, yeah, I mean, every company on the planet in their code of conduct says accepting gift cards is a violation of our code. Who knew that this was happening? Who saw it happening? In some cases, the fact pattern says that employees use the same debit cards that they sent to Colombian drug cartel members to take their piece of the pie Obviously, there was a look the other way element of this. People had to know that that was happening and chose not to say anything. But also, I think there's a definite element of this that is, what happened to the people who did raise their hand and say, we're not keeping up with our risks? What happened to the people who said, our controls are not keeping pace with the growth of the business? I think the monitor that comes in needs to look really carefully at the cultural aspects of this, at the willingness of people to say what's happening in their
Mhm.
particular branches. Because anytime that you have an organization of this size, you're going to wind up with some people who are open to a bribe to look the other way. And so you have to rely on your systems and
Yeah.
your controls to be able to catch those kinds of circumstances. And in this case, from what I can tell, there simply weren't any.
We talked about this earlier this year in our culture report. We talked about the speak up gap, and
Mhm.
something like I think it's like 93% of people say they'd be willing to report misconduct when they see it. When the moment of truth happens, that number drops to 50%. And when you
Yeah.
ask people why, it's because they are afraid of retaliation or they're afraid nothing's going to happen as a result of it. As TD Bank does a cultural stock taking, if you will,
Mhm.
I'd be curious to know what those numbers look like within TD Bank. I think that
Yeah.
might be a really interesting indicator of the health of speak up culture with regards to how much that deteriorated because the bribery culture came up, or if simply other factors were keeping it low, and that helped the bribery culture come up. I think there's
Mhm.
correlation is not always causation, but I'd be curious to see what causalities there could be here. They might be significant.
Inside of any organization, your culture is a combination of your formal systems and your informal systems. Your informal systems are always going to be stronger than your formal systems, right? Your informal systems of sort of how do we do things here, the things that people are not, willing to challenge, the unspoken rules of a particular manager or a particular team or a particular piece of the organization. But when you have really weak formal systems, your informal systems are really going to triumph, right? And so I think one of the things that we see in this particular circumstance is a deliberate underinvestment,
Hmm.
with a name on it, right? A deliberate underinvestment of in the formal systems, coupled with informal systems that can exist inside any organization. And so, to those out there listening to this and thinking to themselves, well, my formal systems are stronger than TD Bank's formal systems, so I'm all good. A, that's probably true, but that's not a real high bar for you to be stepping over. And B, all of us can benefit from spending some time thinking about the ways in which our informal systems may be either augmenting or undermining the formal systems that we've put in place at our organizations.
What is it that Matt Galvin said at the GES? What's the definition of culture?
Culture is the worst behavior an organization will tolerate.
As we head into 2025, life doesn't look like it's going to get any easier for the ethics and compliance space. So be sure to visit ethisphere.com regularly to catch up on the latest news, events, resources, solutions, and more as we all do our part to make the world a better place by advancing business integrity. I'm Bill Coffin, and this has been the Ethicast. For more episodes, please visit the Ethisphere YouTube channel at youtube.com/ethisphere. And if this is your first time enjoying the show, please make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. If you'd like to appear in the show as a guest yourself, drop us a line at ethisphere.com/ethicast. Thanks so much for joining us. And until next time, remember, strong ethics is good business.